Both. Thank you very much as well for joining us tonight. We just heard from Ms. van Staveren that the common myth, according to her, about capitalism is that markets and capitalism always go hand in hand. What do you think is the most common myth these days about capitalism that you keep hearing?
The most common myth is that any type of system, any type of system always has side effects, and there are always people misusing the system. And if it comes to capitalism, first, the question is, what is capitalism? And in my definition, capitalism is about individual initiative, that individual initiative is appreciated, that there is private ownership, and therefore you also need markets. Because once you start with an individual, and you start with this private initiative, private ownership, you do need markets. But what has capitalism in the general notion of capitalism? What do we have in mind? We always combine capitalism with competition. That capitalism, contrary to state planning, communist system, if we put that to the extreme, in capitalism we have competition. In state planning, we do not have competition, and therefore, at least typically, you would really have to organize it. We don't have competition, and therefore, a capitalistic system is more efficient. That's the common notion. That's a common notion of people that defend capitalism. Yeah. But what have we seen in the last 20 years? That the core purpose of corporations is to reduce competition, to prevent competition. And once competition is no longer part of the individual spirit, private ownership, the market economy, if you kill competition, then it means that you have people that do rent-seeking and they can misuse their position. So I find this element of competition absolutely crucial. And the second thing to emphasize is that capitalism, nor socialism, by the way, says anything about fairness, about distribution. One of the most famous laws that we have, or theorems that we have, is the first theorem of welfare economics. And the first theorem of welfare economics talks about Pareto efficiency. And Pareto efficiency is that there is an allocation that you cannot improve on without making somebody worse off. However, this whole notion doesn't say anything about fairness, about distribution. So any type of system, whether it's capitalism, socialism, etc., you need to take care of other concerns like fairness.
Thank you very much. So where do you think that this emphasis on competition within capitalism comes from? Because one could say that it is perceived as a hallmark of what it means to be a capitalist society.
That's absolutely true, because that's the if you talk to the mainstream American industrialist, he will always say the capitalist system is best. You know what? Whoever comes with an idea, and if that idea is superior, he gets the market. So the capitalist system leads to, via competition, leads to innovation, etc., etc. And that's precisely what we have learned the last 20 years in particular. But I think strategists had known it for a much longer time, because every handbook of strategy is about, not necessarily about innovating, but is about how to neutralize competition. So it's truly a preconceived notion, a framing, that capitalism via competition leads to innovation and therefore is superior.
Now, it can be said that financial markets are increasingly more important in the way that we make decisions, and taking your notions from competition and capitalism with respect to the financial markets, you could say that within these financial markets there is a lot of competition, but at the same time the banks and other financial institutions hold a certain monopoly over the way that money gets transferred around the system, etc. What do you think about that? Do you think it's a good idea? How do we actually kind of tackle that monopoly of the banking system?
That's a very good question. Maybe one step back. Do not interpret my comments as being anti-capitalism. My comments are very much about how we should take care of whatever system we have. And we know that a state-led system, a top-down state-led system, has enormous disadvantages, inefficiencies. Therefore, I rather start with the private initiative of capitalism and try to improve that system. With respect to the financial sector, a few dimensions are reinforced in a sense in the financial sector. First, if you, and that just to be very critical of the current financial system, if in the current discussion, because of the difficulties that European banks had over the last 15 years, European banks are currently being talked about as being zombies, having very low value, being very inefficient, etc., etc. And then very often people point at the US, because US banks have a much higher market value, meaning the value of their stock, their shares, relative to what they own. And it's being interpreted as US banks having become much more resilient, having become much more efficient, etc. And here you can have the same story. US banks have done rent seeking to the ultimate extent. And what's rent seeking? Rent seeking is literally that, particularly in the last few years, it has been further fueled, is that consumer protection in the US is very weak, which means that US banks basically have been able to sell financial products in the most negative interpretation to the middle class, let them eat credit. So they have been able to sell financial products at very high cost to the general population. And they have been able to do that because there was not a counterweight against the market power they had. So this is extreme rent seeking, which we have seen in the Dutch market as well. But in the Dutch market, we saw it particularly in the insurance industry, where life insurance, we called it in Dutch boekerpolices, where 7.5 million life insurance policies had been sold to the Dutch population with an implicit cost structure that went up to 40% of the contribution. So 40% of the money that was supposed to be invested for the customer was not being invested, was taken away as cost. So this is what you call rent seeking. And that we have seen in the financial sector. We have seen that to an enormous extent. European banks currently are much more scrutinized, so they have much more difficulty, but they have lost trust of society. So the financial sector has a very difficult time. And if I give the interpretation over the last 30 years, what has happened, finance has become an activity for itself. So the financial sector was basically doing finance for itself. So finance came unrooted from the real economy. So it was no longer facilitating reallocations, allocations in the real economy, which is the whole of finance, but finance became leading. Finance basically was overruling the real economy and disturbing, therefore, the real economy, because finance can be very short-term oriented. You can just trade in the financial market one evening. Those are transactions. And the real economy, these are always more long-term decisions. So finance got all the power. The real economy lost power. And finance, without being rooted in the real economy, cannot serve the real economy. And that's what we have observed.
So these the decoupling you mentioned of the financial sector from the real economy has taken place over the last couple of years, with financialization, or the financial sector becoming a sector which serves itself instead of the real economy. Yet at the same time, I noticed that you talk a bit about morals and a bit about the way how people behave and should behave within within the financial sector. Do you agree that to some extent although the financial sector has decoupled from the real economy, its transactionalist behavior within the financial sector has maybe bled through within society? Have we become, as a society, more transactional as of the way that this emphasis on competition and this ruthlessness within the financial sector has been held into high regard over the last 20, 30 years?
Yes, I wouldn't link it to more competition in the financial sector. Because the financial sector has not been operating based on competition. The financial sector has been operating based on power, based on connections, based on government connections, all kinds of connections. So basically all types of things that basically have decoupled it from competition. And that you also see, because you see very high margins in a variety of financial activities that cannot be easily explained. This development has been going on actually for the last 20, 30 years. It's not just the last few years. It's a long-term development, and the long-term development there's always reinforcement. So once the financial sector becomes too dominant. Financial sector is transaction-oriented, typically. That's the way it has developed. Once it becomes too dominant, it is going to affect the real economy because it likes to do transactions. And you can do transactions by merging, by acquisitions, by selling off business units, etc., etc. And there, the role of finance reinforces the transaction orientation of the real economy. So that's one thing. And the other thing is these reinforcements you really have to identify, because otherwise you cannot understand why maybe 25 years after the Second World War, there were very few problems, and then suddenly there are many problems. And what happened to finance? So people will say, oh, there was deregulation starting in the 1980s. But the deregulation didn't come out of nowhere. Typically, deregulation is a political process and it follows forces in society. And one of the important forces that we have seen in the last 25, 30 years is information technology, the role of information technology. And one of the prime things that information technology does is it facilitates markets, particularly also financial markets. You can trade anything, any moment. And the same applies to business units. You can easily sell now business units in the real economy. So being able to transact, and transact is all short-term oriented, leads to pressure because the finance people want to have more transactions, also want to have more transactions in the real economy, and technology has facilitated it. And given the technology, the regulation became outdated and it was being reinterpreted as we need deregulation.
Thank you, Mr. Boot.